Thank you so much. Marathon Dershathon continues. And for the, what is not even seventh inning stretch, I just wanted to have a little moment of levity here, bringing to order the third panel. This panel's focus is on teaching, and it's already come up several times that in everything that he does, Alan Dershowitz is a teacher, and we have a spectacular panel that includes students, former students, co-teachers, colleagues, and I will not take up any more of their time. We will proceed alphabetically, starting first with Phil Heymann, who, as former Attorney General in the Clinton administration, I think had some arguments with Alan, but as his colleague and as his friend, I think has lots of good things to say. Phil Heymann.
Does this go on automatically?
I think it should be on.
Okay. I would like to tell you frankly that I'm getting tired of all this flattering praise for my next door neighbor in the office, Alan Dershowitz. And I see no particular reason to carry it over to the teaching area.
Louder. Let's put it right under your mouth.
Alan's going to suggest not. I see no particular reason to carry this silly flattery over to the teaching area. It's true that he has been a creator and preserver of important curriculum in the criminal law area. He long ago questioned the law school's sort of fallen into decision to teach first-year criminal law by first teaching substantive criminal law, what are crimes, what do you require for a crime, and then separately criminal procedure. When can you be arrested? When can you be how can you be interrogated? What does the prosecution have to furnish? His experience told him that the subjects belonged together in law school as they were inextricably intertwined in court. So without asking me or anyone else, he went ahead and designed and executed that plan, creating a brand new type of criminal law course. Nor do I think he deserves unusual credit for joining about 20,000 alumni, I would estimate, in arguing that our students should not graduate as they do now, not having anything about their right not to be arrested, their right to have privacy, their right not to incriminate themselves, their right to have the prosecutor reveal exculpatory evidence. We've now abandoned all that. His scholarship as a teacher seems to me just to have taken a lucky turn. No one else seems to have noticed that in one way or another we were detaining vast numbers of people in the United States. We were detaining them for mental illness, we were detaining them pending trial, we were detaining them for any number of reasons. And now, of course, we're detaining them as terrorists. And no one else seems to have noticed that the vast number of people were being detained based on a prediction of what they would do in the future that we had no skills whatsoever in making. It was being made with no standards for applying whatever we guessed would be the risk that they would commit further crimes or do damage, and with no procedures designed to assure that it was being used only where those standards could be sensibly met. So other people didn't notice it. It was nevertheless irritating to see him the first one to write, quote, "People are confined to prevent predicted harms without any systematic effort to decide what kinds of harms warrant preventive confinement, or what degree of likelihood should be required, or what duration of preventive confinement should be permitted, or what relationship should exist between the likelihood of damage and the duration." Who did he think he was, challenging our growing tendency to wing it? Using prevention when we want it. That's what it's called to be a free nation. And however, we found it found its way to Guantanamo. And it is true that his fearlessness in his choice of arguments to make, irritating as that exercise of free speech and free thought is, and his ruthlessness in pressing any argumentative advantage, made him a model of a lawyer committed to the truth as he saw it. And seeing that taught his students what it was to be a great lawyer. But still, there's been, when you consider it, on balance, too much praise. He resisted, quote, soundness, unquote, and, quote, balance, unquote, as if they were diseases. I had the questionable benefit of jointly teaching a course with Alan and my son Steve, a federal prosecutor. What I wanted to do, you'll be the only people who will have ever learned what I intended to do, was to explore soundly and in a balanced way what was the legally undefined or factually obscure areas in which prosecutors had to make decisions even though there was no clear answer. I pictured myself, with the help of Alan and my son Steve, bringing reason to a heated, endless argument between prosecutors and defense attorneys or their ambassadors at law schools, distinguishing as we worked willful wrongdoers from those struggling in good faith with hard decisions. I opened the seminar with Alan on one side of me and my son Steve on the other, and I began to explain that purpose. Two sentences into my description of the ethical dilemmas of even the most honorable prosecutor, Alan happily, gaily exploded, calling the fictional prosecutor a cheat like most others he'd met. My son Steve quickly interrupted him to denounce the world of criminal defense attorneys in equally impassioned and unreasoned terms. The debate, with accusations in the form of war stories on both sides, lasted the full 12 weeks of the class, to the pleasure of both of them. The accusation that some have made that I'm only irritated because the students loved it is false and libelous. The students were watching an impassioned advocate and experienced attorney creating a necessary and remarkable teaching product. They were learning what it meant to be a lawyer committed to a client's cause and believing that the spirited argument his convictions demanded was, when met in turn with an equally spirited rebuttal, as good a path to the truth as human beings had ever come by. We shall all miss Alan as a friend, colleague, and to the students, teacher, and mentor. As his neighbor, I will miss him every day.
I think we have to have better evidence than that, so we're going to a student. So Mike Materni, who is currently a teaching fellow helping Alan with the freshman seminar, has been Alan's student since he arrived here. He's currently a student in our doctoral program, and I think he has some things to say.
Yeah. All right. First of all, I just want to say it's a great honor for me to be here with all these famous people, to be able to say thank you to Alan for everything that you've done, not just for me, but for about 50 generations of law students before me, for Harvard Law School, for the world of academia, and for democracy and public discourse. As Minow said, I got to experience Alan under three facets of his great persona. I had him as my teacher, and as Harvey Silverglade pointed out, he started my legal ethics class by saying that most of us were statistically most likely to become criminal defendants than criminal defense attorneys. I had been a criminal defense attorney for 2 years, and I was wondering if Harvard was going to change that. Thankfully, it didn't. Then I got to teach with Alan as his teaching fellow in this wonderful freshman seminar. Some of the students, past and current, are here, and that's very nice. And I've had Alan as my mentor here in my doctoral studies, which are ongoing. And I want to say a little bit about these three experiences. First, as a teacher, we have heard about his scholarship. I want to talk about his way of teaching. The thing that impresses me the most is that 50 years on the job, if you dare to go to see him before class, the kindest man I know is going to send you away and say, sorry, I got to prepare for class. He still prepares every day, every class. He's a very dedicated teacher, and he has a wonderful way of teaching, which is through hypotheticals. He's the hypo king. He will ask you questions, and then you come up with an answer, and say, oh, great. So he changes it, and changes it, and changes it, until you have nowhere else to go. And I think it's a great way because that tests ideas. It verifies, how far an idea can go. Although we had last week the experience with one of our freshman students who just didn't cave in. He went harder and harder and harder, and she just, she stood her ground. So as a teacher, Alan has been great, has been inspirational, has been nice. I remember one of my favorite stories during commencement. He, there's 1 million people down in the tent on Jarvis Field, and I went to say hi to him, and he just asked me, "Is your family here?" I said, "Well, my dad is here, but he's just somewhere far off." He insisted on following me through 1 million people to go say hi to my father. He sat down and started talking to my father, and I thought that was truly amazing. And I'm going to take this little story as a segue into mentorship. I have had a great experience with Alan as my mentor. He has guided me, but he has never tried to impose his own views. He pushes me so that my views can come out and can flourish. One of the things I like the most is that he will have a different perspective than anybody else on any given subject. We have heard how much he has written. He has thought a lot more. I still have to go to Alan with an issue that he has not have an opinion on. So I wrote this paper. Whenever I write something, I just send it to him to read my first draft and give comments. So I give him my paper. I come into the office a week later, and he goes, "Oh, Michael, your paper completely persuaded me of 2 points, neither of which is the point we're trying to make." So I was like, "All right, moving on." But I'm very thankful. I think it's been a great opportunity to confront my work and my ideas and my project with somebody who, some people mentioned it, I wouldn't believe it until I tried it myself, somebody who likes to be challenged. It is not the situation, which is very common, for example, back in Europe, where the student goes and he's a little nobody and just listens to the professor blabber about stuff. With Alan, you go, he says something, the harder you fight back, the better it is, because, and this goes back to his teaching, he sees conflict and controversy over ideas as a way to move forward for all of us. And he teaches that to students by example, which I think is fantastic. I just want to finish with another little story. Oh, actually, before I do that, it's funny because you would think, he always has the last word. He loves that. If you read at the end of his book, he has an after-death last word. He writes the rebuttal to an obituary. And it is really nice when sometimes I get to have the last word. It's not that often, but sometimes I manage to win one. Alan has been always very kind, very generous. The hardest thing to do is give him a present, because then he'll give you a present. So then you feel obliged to give him a present, and it's just never ending. So he gave me an 1832 lithograph of Harvard around Christmas, because I'm not Jewish. And then I decided to give him a nice book. So he said, "Oh, I owe you. If you give me a book." But what he wrote in the book was this inscription with this exhortation, which I hope I'll manage. It will be hard to follow, but it just captured his spirit and what he has been teaching to students for the past 50 years, and that is never compromise intellectually. Thank you for teaching me that, and I hope I'll succeed.
There was a class taught on this campus jointly by Alan Dershowitz, Steven Pinker, our next speaker, that I wanted to take so desperately, and so I'm going to listen with all ears. Steven Pinker, who is a college professor here at Harvard and the Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology, is probably known to everybody here, so it feels ridiculous for me to introduce him. He has made cognitive science accessible. He has made linguistics important to people who'd never heard of it, and he has written about the topics in psychology, experimental psychology, and science in a way that make us all understand why it's so important. So Steven Pinker, we're so glad you're here.
Thank you. Many of you remember that Harvard University used to have a president named Lawrence Summers, and in January 2005, President Summers gave a lecture at a closed economic conference devoted to the question of why the representation of men and women in schools of engineering, math, and science wasn't exactly 50-50. Larry Summers gave what would be a fairly standard talk in labor economics, pointing out that the mere fact that the ratio is not 50-50 does not in itself prove that there was discrimination or hidden barriers. There are a number of alternative hypotheses, such as different interests, different range of distributions at the extremes, and perhaps even differences in inherent aptitude. He did not take, in representation of the two genders, he did not take a stand as to which was the correct answer. He offered some hunches as to how he would order them, including discrimination, suspected that they all played a role. Well, many of you know what happened next. One of the participants in the symposium reported it to the Boston Globe. There was a brouhaha, a hoo-ha. Many faculty were calling for Larry's head and other parts of his anatomy. And a year and a half later, he resigned, in part because of the furor that erupted from this speech. Now, this is a remarkable phenomenon for those of us who are interested in questions of academic freedom and the pursuit of the truth. Namely, it is certainly more than legitimate to argue that Larry was incorrect in some of these hypotheses, but there was rage that he so much as broached the possibility of one of the hypotheses being true. Namely, he breached a taboo being a norm that certain ideas may not be discussed in private, regardless of whether they are held in private. Well, Alan Dershowitz, who is, as you all know, is quite interested in issues of academic freedom and free speech more generally, in an interview to the Harvard Crimson, said, one of these days I want to teach a course on the phenomenon of taboo. Well, I read that and I called him on the phone and I said, let's do it. I, like Alan, like Larry, have taken some controversial positions, although my interest in taboo was more scholarly. I'm interested in language and communication, and I am, at the time, was deeply interested in why the phenomenon of taboo should exist. Why should there be thoughts that are immoral to speak about, or, and in many cases, immoral to think? Our lives are saturated with taboo and hypocrisy. A lot of our speech is not to be taken at face value, designed to hide some hidden terrible truth. From table manners, we say, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome, which when you think about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but we don't say, give me the salt. On a date, someone might say, would you like to come up and see my etchings? We all know what the underlying intent is. Many of us have been at fundraising dinners in which a dean might say to the audience, we're counting on you to show leadership in our campaign for the future. Instead of, if you give a pot of money, we will name a building after you. Why can't we just say what we mean? Now, this is a phenomenon that saturates our everyday life, which is a good thing. It also tends to bleed over into legal, political, and scholarly life, where it may not be such a good thing. That was the impetus for our course. We each gave lectures. What came out was our very different teaching styles. I'm a PowerPoint, bullet point kind of guy. Alan is Socratic, walking up and down the stairs, challenging students one-on-one. The class was enormously subscribed, more than 400 students. We had a roster of guest lecturers who, in one way or another, had written or spoken about or breached various taboos. We had a lecture on race differences, a lecture on sex differences, a lecture on religion, a lecture on morality. Randy Kennedy came and gave a lecture on his book, Nigger. We had Harvey Silverglade as a guest lecturer. And Alan and I planned as our final guest lecturer to have Larry Summers. kind of closing the loop, a satisfying arc. But we thought that we would make it a surprise to the class, as a treat for those who went all the way through. Well, another feature of our class was that before we met in Science Center B, 45 minutes before every lecture, Alan and I would sit down for coffee at the cafeteria. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned about Alan, by the way, is that he is one of the world's great kibitzers. I am, like many people, amazed not just at Alan's ability to accomplish things, to teach, to write, to be an advocate, to write articles and books, but it just makes it seem so easy because he always has time to sit around for coffee and just kind of shoot the breeze. At the same time as accomplishing all these amazing things. Well, we were having our weekly kibitz before our class. Sometimes students would see us and join us. And before the final class, a couple of students came by very sheepishly, and they said, well, there have been a lot of rumors as to who the final guest lecturer is going to be. Is it true that the final guest lecturer is going to be O.J. Simpson? Well, it was not O.J. Simpson. We went to the lecture hall. The entire class was there, plus many spectators curious about who the final surprise lecturer would be. It was, the minutes were ticking by, no guest lecturer. Class was getting kind of restless. And then exactly at, I think it was 2 o'clock, the rear doors of the lecture hall burst open, and Larry Summers came bounding down the stairs, got a standing ovation, joined us on a stage, and he said, in what was surely a well-practiced line, I can't imagine why you would have someone like me lecturing in a course like this. And he got some polite laughter. And without missing a beat, Alan said, maybe that was the problem. And the lecture hall erupted with great hilarity. What I learned from the course was, first of all, a theme that has been mentioned many times today of what an astonishingly dedicated teacher Alan is. We decided in planning the course that we would divide up the grading, and this involved papers from 400 students, 200 each. What I hadn't realized is that for my grading, I did what many professors in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences do. Our department hires a graduate student grader, and the graduate student does all the grading. I only learned that when we divided it up, this was quite an unfair bargain, because the law school, I learned, does not hire graders, and Alan himself graded every last one of those 200 and some odd papers. I also learned from another collaboration, not a collab, I should say, a guest appearance, that Alan not only teaches widely subscribed, notorious, famous classes which attract a lot of attention, but the freshman seminars, which are a couple of dozen fresh-faced, fresh people, where Alan does it just for the pleasure of the give and take of introducing young minds to the pleasures of debate and scholarship and learning, and I've had the great fortune to be a guest in several of the freshman seminars that Alan has given. But most of all, in examining the topic of taboo, both as a scholarly topic in its own right and as a factor that lurks behind many scholarly debates, I came to an appreciation of Alan's own career, which is very much about the topic of taboo. Because despite Alan's reputation as a controversialist, a bad boy, a provocateur, an enfant terrible, many of his positions are really not all that controversial if you were forced to confront them. I don't think if anyone was pressed, they would deny that even an unlikable, probably guilty defendant has the right not only to criminal defense, but to excellent criminal defense. I mean, who could actually sit down and argue that an unpopular defendant should not get good legal representation? Among all the critics of Israel, how many of them would actually say, no, Israel really should be destroyed, it does not have the right to exist? Among all the people who've weighed in on the torture debate, how many would say, well, in the ticking bomb scenario, let the bomb go off, don't do anything to the person who knows where the bomb is hidden, or for that matter, who would say, nah, torture does not take place. We don't have to deal with it on any legal basis. The police never practice it sub rosa. Probably very few. What Alan does is he takes these beliefs that deep down many people believe, and he brings them to the surface. Part of his more general philosophy of the law, that the law is not a place for the genteel politeness and hypocrisy that governs our informal day-to-day interactions. We are all liable to carry over our everyday habits into the legal and scholarly arena where they don't belong. That explicitness and confronting issues verbally, where they can be exposed to the light and argued, is an imperative in scholarly and legal life. It is that willingness to confront the issue of taboo that I think has defined Alan's career both intellectually and in practice. I think it's something for which we should all be grateful. So thank you, Alan, as a teacher, a friend, and as a challenger of taboo.
Joel Barry Pollak is another former student of Alan's, and he flew in for this occasion. He is currently the editor-in-chief and in-house counsel for Breitbart.com, and he's a political commentator. He's an author, and I don't think that he suffers private hypocrisies without considerable discussion. So we're so delighted you're here, Joel.
Thank you. Well, I think I'm here also to represent the affirmative action for conservatives view on the panel. I've sat on the far right until I realized, of course, from your perspective, it's the far left. But I think it's also important to note that in addition to President Obama and many of the members of the country's liberal establishment, Alan Dershowitz has many students in the conservative world as well, some of whom are described in his book. The most notorious of whom right now is Ted Cruz, who is being argumentative on the floor of the Senate for 21 hours straight, and probably learned some of those skills and some of that boldness from Alan Dershowitz. He's don't be embarrassed by the association. You have many new fans in conservative land. I think the fact that Alan's students run that spectrum and beyond is a testament to how passionate he is about teaching, how effective he is about teaching, and reflects a lot of what has been said today already about his absolute enthusiasm for challenging students to form arguments that are different from those they're used to consider alternative points of view, to push people beyond taboo and to think about what their true beliefs are. And my experience as a student was that this actually sometimes caused me to agree with him, and certainly as a 14-year-old picking up chutzpah for the first time, which was my introduction to Alan Dershowitz, finding so much that inspired me and really shaped the way I think about politics, about Israel, about a lot of issues. But also as a student in his classes, finding my convictions deepened when I disagreed with him about certain things. And I wasn't always outwardly observant in my Judaism, and one of the reasons I became so, it occurred to me several years after the fact, was because of an argument I had with him in class one day. We were discussing affirmative action policies in general, and it came down to the question of race. And it was an ethical question for lawyers. Do you, as a female lawyer or as a black lawyer, allow yourself to appear in court when you're not actually doing that much work on a case, but in order to convince skeptical members of a jury that the defendant is more sympathetic and so forth? At what point do you object to such uses of race by the law firm you might be working for? What kind of ethical dilemmas do these create? And I put up my hand and said, well, it shouldn't create any. Everyone's an individual. And he shot back, in his Socratic argumentative style. Well, it's easy for you to say because you're not necessarily outwardly Jewish. You can hide who you are. I said, that's it. I'm going to prove him wrong every day I go out there. I'm going to be who I am. I'm going to be myself in spite of whatever label, and the label is out there. I refuse to accept that group identity is sort of fungible for some people, not for others, and it really, in a sense, strengthened my opposition to a point he was making. But that's what he does. He really causes students to examine their own convictions and to live those convictions. It occurred to me, an analogy occurred to me from my high school chemistry class. I had a brilliant chemistry teacher, one of the other great teachers I had, who once took a supersaturated solution. This is a solution that has more than the concentration it ought to have. It looks like a normal liquid until you drop a tiny crystal substance in it, whereupon it instantly crystallizes and suddenly it becomes solid. And it's almost a perfect analogy because that's what Professor Dershowitz does in a discussion. He takes this morass of ideas, this supersaturated world of debates and confusions that students come into a classroom with and challenges students to form their convictions, to take a side, to take their position. The only reason it's not an apt analogy is that that supersaturated solution becomes a solid. It never changes after that point, whereas in Professor Dershowitz's class, you may find you leave the class with the opposite view you came in with, and that's part of the exercise. I want to just talk about a few episodes that illustrate what he means as a teacher on campus. First of all, his passion for teaching is equal to, perhaps greater than his passion for litigation, which was spoken about earlier, and it's something that spills over not just in the classroom, into larger and larger classrooms, but all over the campus. And one of the things I always have really appreciated about Harvard, even though often my friends in the conservative media like to ridicule it as a bastion of liberalism and so forth, is the dynamic debate that's here and the tolerance for difference. And I know Charles Ogletree was here earlier. Dean Minow has always been a very faithful correspondent. We write letters. This is a common praise that alumni give, that she always responds to things people say. These are people, Charles Ogletree, for example, I can't think of a single issue on which I agree with him, but what a wonderful teacher. And that kind of environment comes from individuals, but it also comes from the ethic that Professor Dershowitz has stood for 50 years, the idea of openness, of debate. And on many issues, he has provided that umbrella of protection for people who are seeking the truth, no matter what their political orientation. That passion really drives so much of the healthy environment here on campus for everybody. Another thing he does that is unique among professors is he is an advocate for students. And I don't know if you remember this story, but when I was an undergraduate, there was a senior who burnt down her dorm room when she lit Hanukkah candles. And the administration came down on her like a ton of bricks. She had lit the menorah and she had neglected it, and it had burned down the dorm room. And she was sent to the ad board, and they wanted to suspend her and so forth. And he intervened and said, "I will defend you. I will fight the ad board. This is an expression of religious freedom." She eventually just wanted it to all go away, so she sort of declined the intervention. But that's how passionate an advocate he is for students in every part of the university, not just at the law school. And students know they have a friend in him, which is one of the reasons he's so popular, even among students who've never taken his courses. And of course, there's his advocacy for Israel, which was mentioned earlier, but he really is a light in the darkness of how, I suppose, one-sided international debate has become. He is a person who's contributed through his advocacy on Israel to a broader notion of what it means to be a citizen in the United States. There really is something Jeffersonian about his advocacy, his passion for that cause in pursuing the truth above all else. And that really creates an environment on campus that is unique here for students, particularly Jewish students, but other students who sympathize and empathize with Israel. It's unique in the Ivy League. It's unique all across America to know that there's an advocate of that stature on campus. There's a sense of warmth and welcoming that is here, and that has also reverberated throughout the law school through Dean Kagan's tenure, through Martha Minow, through the appearances of Justice Barak and others on our campus who've contributed to that as well. Lastly, I'll just say I had the privilege also of working as a research assistant for Professor Dershowitz, and one of the things he's notorious for is thanking his research assistants. He has a larger-than-life personality, but a very deep and real humility. And my wife, who also took the Taboo course with Professor Pinker and Professor Dershowitz, sends her regards. She wishes she could be here. We were frequent guests at his house. We were always part of his family's life. He invites his research assistants, his students even, into his home to be part of this wonderful community of intellectuals that centers around him. And I'll tell just a brief anecdote, the classic, I think, Professor Dershowitz anecdote. It was the day that Elliot Spitzer had been kind of exposed by federal law enforcement in this whole prostitution scandal, and the charges were so scandalous and so damning that when I entered his office that day, I heard him dictating an op-ed to one of the other research assistants, and I heard this strident tone of voice, and I was certain that he was giving Spitzer, absolute hell over how could he do this and so forth. It was the most passionate defense of Elliot Spitzer you could. In fact, maybe it had been the only defense of Elliot Spitzer that appeared that day, but it was passionate, it was well argued, and even then it destroyed my expectations. He always does that, always manages to provoke and surprise. What a wonderful intellectual, what a fantastic American. Thank you, Professor Dershowitz, for your continued friendship.
Thank you, Joel, and thanks for being here. It's really, really meaningful. Alan Stone is another colleague of Alan Dershowitz's and someone who has also taught with him, argued with him, and he is also a psychiatrist. I'm not going to say what he might say, so let's hear from Alan. He's also a film critic.
The law school isn't paying me enough to psychoanalyze Alan. But I do have some memories of things we shared together. And that's what I want to talk about, and talk about how I see Alan Dershowitz as a teacher. So Alan and I first started teaching. There was a seminar room in the back of the Langdell Library. We started teaching together in 1965. That's before some of you here were born. And so we were teaching these preposterous courses called Psychoanalytic Theory and Legal Assumptions, and Psychiatry and Law. And somehow, I don't know how, it was mostly Alan's doing. Within 2 years, we weren't in the seminar room. We were in Austin East. And the place was packed, and people were coming in. The marshal of Harvard, who I happen to know who he was, every time there was an important visitor to Harvard, they would bring them to our class. Now, I soon realized I wasn't co-teaching a class, I was participating in a happening. And the question for me was, how did Alan Dershowitz make it happen? I knew I wasn't making it happen. I didn't move the class from the seminar room to Austin East. So I thought, well, how did he make it happen? Now, the first thing I would say about him was he was kind of a magician. He taught, not like most professors, he taught by pulling rabbits out of the hat. The rabbit might be a case, it might be the judge who decided the case, it might be a historical fact, but whatever it was, it set all your expectations off. It was not what you were expecting. And then the amazing thing about him was that when you thought, okay, that's it, he would pull another rabbit out of that topped everything that had gone before. It was just an incredible display of yes, he wears his erudition lightly, but it displayed an incredible erudition. And the rabbits were real. The facts were truth that he told us. Now, many people think of Alan as a contrarian. I don't think he was a contrarian. I see him as a neo-Hegelian. So Hegel has the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And Alan Dershowitz was an expert on the antithesis. It didn't matter whether the thesis was moral or legal or soundness. Alan Dershowitz would attack it. But it wasn't like a wild man. It was a man who had an idea. And so there was always this incredible sense of, this is fantastic, but somehow this man has grounded it. Now, I would say at this point, in my view, Alan Dershowitz is, as I said to his wife, is one of a kind. I don't think there will ever be another Alan Dershowitz. I mean, he is an extraordinary human being, both in terms of his intellect, in terms of his rhetorical, as the quickness of his mind, and the time in our history that he comes along. I think he is unique. Now, one of the things he did in his antithesis way was bomb away at the ivory tower of Harvard, right in class. That I thought was amazing. Every time he did it, I sat up and took notice. Now, another aspect you heard about in the whole panel, I think this was later in his career, when instead of pulling rabbits out of the hat, he was giving us hypotheticals. But the hypotheticals were always from practice. So some law professors' ambition is to be judges or philosophers, and some would like to be both. And that forms the deep structure of their teaching, in my view. Now, I am only a psychologist. So this is the deep structure of their teaching. Now, the fault with that is there's only a small percentage of their students who can identify with that. The law review students can identify with those people and think, oh, I can be like that. The deep structure of Alan Dershowitz's teaching was the practitioner. And so he spoke to the entire class. They could identify with him. And when he gave you a hypothetical, and the hypotheticals of law professors, the first year hypotheticals, are I would say, are the empirical reality of the lawyer curled up and hidden in abstruse hypotheticals. But Dershowitz hypotheticals, they were fantastic, but they were real. He did have a client who shot somebody who was already dead. That Jackson story was true. It was the law of attempts, I remember. And he would pull these things out, and they were real. Now, another aspect of Alan that made it happen is Alan's biblical identity. He mentions other people. I think he came to Harvard Law School thinking of himself as David going up against Goliath. And he was the boy gladiator. Now, I do not know if Alan actually loves the law, as some law professors claim they do. But I know he believes in and loves the adversarial system. And it is a defining aspect of his being, of his wisdom, and of his teaching. He is prepared to debate a Supreme Court justice, a university professor, and his students. Now, his version of the Socratic dialogue can be an intense adversarial exchange, not the kind that was described here. I've seen him with the wraps taken off. But that, now some students did wilt under the pressure, and I'm going to tell you about one who did. But I think it can be and was a defining educational experience and life experience that made law school different than every other kind of education the person had gotten. So one class early in our teaching together, Alan got carried away. And I don't know if you noticed that when he gets carried away, he starts davening. Those of you who are Jews will know what that means, but those of you who don't, when Jews pray, they rock back and forth like that. So he got carried away and he started davening, and he told the student he was wrong on the facts, he was wrong on the law, and he was wrong in life. It was quite an experience. So, now, that was in the early 70s when we were in Austin East. And in those days, it may be hard for you people to believe, but people actually used to smoke in the back rows of Austin East during class.
I didn't know that. Well,
So this student came to the next few classes, sat in the second row, and smoked marijuana and blew it at Dersh. Now, and he also came to my office hours and discussed this trauma in his life. Now, he was thrilled that he could blow this marijuana at Dershowitz, and Dershowitz had no idea what was going on. He didn't even know it was happening. He was so uncool. So of course, the student loved that. And he thought, in some way, he was implicating you in a crime. You were in a place where marijuana was being smoked. Now, 2 weeks later, however, he was waving his hand and eager to get back into another argument with Dersh. And he has remained a friend of mine, and I can tell you he has become a criminal lawyer, and Dersh is his role model. And I would say the interesting thing is there are many students for whom Dersh is not their role model, but for many of them, he is a benchmark for zealous advocacy. Now, another aspect of how he made it happen is Dershowitz, as I would call him, Mr. Relevant.
Mr. What?
Mr. Relevant. He would always find a way to talk about what was going on that week. We talk about movies that are ripped from the headlines. Alan's classes would be ripped from the headlines. But he would always show us, I thought it was amazing, how the law, adversarial, zealous advocacy, and legal procedure was relevant to the thing. And I think that made it an incredibly important educational experience. Another aspect of Alan Dershowitz, the teacher, I would say, is the man without a mask. Professor Dershowitz is there for you to see. Although the truth is often ignored or denied, who your teacher is as a human being is just as important as what he or she teaches you. But many teachers assume a mask of neutral anonymity and hide from the students who they are and what they believe. But Professor Dershowitz, as I like to say, was the first Jewish Jew at Harvard. Now that I think is quite important. I think it relates to much of what you were saying. He was the first Jewish Jew, and his students knew it. He was a civil libertarian, and his students knew it. He was an ardent defender of Israel, and his students knew it. He was an active practitioner, and his students knew it. He challenged authority whenever he saw it. Thank you. And his students knew it. He got carried away in his adversarial enthusiasm, and his students knew it. One ambition of great teachers, those who teach you about life as well as the law, is to be fully known by their students. Alan Dershowitz is the only Harvard Law professor who comes close to that. Alan and I resumed teaching together after 2 decades of going our separate way. He went on to teach with all these great people. And I would say he is no longer David the gladiator. He's gotten over that. He is now a Goliath of the legal universe. The one teacher at Harvard whom students' parents recognize. Students tell me as I meet them in the elevator, I just had Dershowitz sign his book for my father. He'll be so thrilled. I think Alan Dershowitz is the most famous lawyer of his generation. He's still challenging authority, but now he is also sharing his wisdom, and he is still learning by teaching. I have 2 final thoughts. Alan and I have taught together for many years. He is, as I've described, he could be a scalding debater who pulls no punches. Yet in all the years we have taught together, Alan has never said an unkind word to me. I think that's an amazing testimonial. Finally, I think this is the appropriate moment to say that I owe my career at Harvard Law School to Alan Dershowitz. He brought me over from McLean Hospital, and I was not a patient. And the medical school. He guided me through the shoals of Dean Griswold's misgivings, and he got me an appointment here and saw me through the tenure process. Alan Dershowitz has a great gift, not just for teaching, but also for friendship.
Well, in a minute, I'm going to give Alan a chance for rebuttal. I'm going to ask Charlie Nesson if he wants to make a comment. But first, I have a dean's prerogative. So one of the interesting things about being dean is that not every member of the faculty is compliant. Not everybody on the faculty turns their grades in on time. Not everybody in the faculty is willing to teach in the room that they're assigned, the time that they're assigned. I would like to point out, in the midst of everything else that Alan Dershowitz does, trying cases, writing 1 million books, writing 1 million blog posts, he turns his grades in on time, always. He does not cancel class except for Jewish holidays, which I would like to point out, underscoring what Alan Stone just said, he was the first person to do. And so when I joined the faculty and said I want to not have class on a Jewish holiday, and no one did it except Alan, it was okay. But Alan is actually a love as a colleague from a dean's point of view. Now, just 2 more things, though, just as a colleague. Alan is always teaching. Alan sits down at the faculty lunch table when people are talking about what's in the New York Times or what's the sports scores, and Alan asks a question. And then he asks another question. And then the discussion gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then, Alan leaves because he has things to do, and people are still arguing. Alan, even when he's not around, has his door to his office is an education. Because I was lucky enough to have an office near Alan's for a long time, and Alan traditionally posts on the door hate mail that he gets. And I was shocked. I thought, what is this? And Alan, what is this? He said, I want people to learn. I want people to know. I want people to know what's out there. And it really goes to something Steven Pinker said. It's taboo, but if we don't talk about it, that's not helpful. Let's see what hate looks like. And it looks pretty stupid. So Alan Dershowitz is a teacher in everything that you do. You get a rebuttal, but Charlie Nesson maybe first?
You're welcome, Charlie.
Oh, good.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, I will impose on you just very briefly. I know I stand between you and
A break.
a break. I've asked to comment and have just very limited. Alan mentioned mischief. He was here as a young teacher when I came here in 1966. And I was awed from the first by a man who clearly believed in himself. This was, to me, his core. He burned with a passion for justice, and he expressed it as a love of law through belief in himself. Not a man who would hide his light. He was out there. And he was, just as Alan says, he and still is the first Jew at Harvard Law School. He is. That's who Alan is. I wanted to say something broader. Alan is a master arguer. What I listened to today was his mastery of a multiplicity of fields in which to display this extraordinary skill of him as an arguer. He has come to typify the form. He represents a form of argument. And last, I'd like to mention Alan's one desire, as he expressed it, to have some influence on the next 50 years of education. My suggestion to Alan is, and my request on behalf of the Berkman Center, Harvard Law School, and Harvard, is that Alan make a gift to us of the right to exploit, to develop the Dershowitz as an arguer in the online universe of education that I see coming. I believe that if we could train the world to argue as well as Dersh, and I believe it, we could do it with a Dershowitz, that he would indeed have had an enormous influence on the next 50 years of education. To Alan, I love you.
Thank you all so much. But what you reveal is my ultimate frustration about my life, and that's this. There's an old expression, you can't take it with you. The reality is you do take it with you. What you take with you when you end your life are most of your very good ideas. I've expressed a lot of ideas in 30 books and 50 articles and 50 years of teaching, but I have so many other ideas, and I'm just feeling passionate about trying to get them out and frustrated about not being able to get them out. I mean, I can't stop trying to do that. And Charlie's idea of some way of working with the Berkman Center, and it's going to be frustrating because these days, if I can't get it out in a column, if I can't get it out in an article or a book, I can get it out in class. And as you say, I try to be relevant. I read something in the paper. I try to figure out how it's relevant to what we're teaching. My son Jamie has cautioned me. In fact, I think he disagrees with me about ending my teaching career because he really thinks, and I think he's right, that I get an enormous amount out of teaching. I tell my students my criteria for a great class is when I've learned something new from them. And I don't know what it's going to be like not to have my daily exposure or 2 or 3 times a week exposure to my students. So it's frustrating. I have to figure out a way of, I thought of it this way sometime. For the first 30 years of your life, or 40 years, whatever it is, you're taking it in. You're learning. And for the last 40 years, especially since I met Carolyn in 1982, I have been giving it back, giving it out, 30 books in the 30 years since I've known Carolyn. I'm going to try to do a few more of those, but it will never, ever represent what you know. I remember, I don't want to be maudlin about it, but my last conversation with my dear friend Bob Nozick. I taught with Bob Nozick for many years, a course on thinking about thinking. I taught it with Bob, and I taught it with Stephen Jay Gould. And when Bob was dying, he said to me that his greatest frustration is his 5 great books, and his books are classics, they'll be read for eternity, that even in his 5 books, he only touched the tip of the iceberg of his ideas, and he was going to die with many of his ideas unexpressed. And I think the internet and other ways that we can communicate now have to be a substitute for teaching, because ultimately you lose the physical energy to teach every day, but you don't hopefully lose the physical or mental acuity to be able to communicate your ideas. So maybe we should go back to having something like the Talmud in the old days, where the rabbis would get together and write their ideas and put them down. There has to be a vehicle for making sure that the world doesn't lose ideas. I think of this often. I'll be quick, but I'm thinking these kinds of thoughts. Carolyn remembers that about 5 years ago, I was in Hamburg speaking to lawyers, German lawyers, and I asked how many of them were victims, directly or indirectly, of the Holocaust. And maybe 3 hands went up of Jewish lawyers from the back of the room. And I said, no, I want to ask you all a question. How many of you have lost parents or loved ones to cancer or heart disease or diabetes or other dreaded illnesses? And every hand went up. And I said, how can you be sure that the cures for those illnesses didn't go up in the smoke of Auschwitz? How can you know you weren't victims? And they all came over to me afterward, and they said, they really now think of themselves as victims. Can you imagine how much wisdom the world lost in the Shoah? How much wisdom the world lost during slavery, when we didn't educate millions of people who were capable of producing some of the great works that we now know Skip Gates has found and seen us produced. So we all have to work together to figure out how to, the difference between human beings and other mammals, or other mammals can't communicate their experiences to each other generationally over time. We can, but we don't do a perfect job at it. So my hope is that we can figure out ways of being able to take what we've accumulated over all these years and communicate them and make the world a better place. And thank you all for having taught with me, having learned with me. All of you taught with me, because when I teach you, you teach me, and it's been such a great pleasure teaching together, Alan, for almost half a century. And Steve, we had such wonderful experiences, and we've had wonderful experiences. So thank you, and let's all keep teaching and learning.
We're going to take a deep breath and a small pause before the last panel, which is Alan Dershowitz, Public Intellectual. Don't go away. We'll be back in about 5 minutes.